Hi everybody, welcome to session 9 of Church History, and as you can see it's a little bit of a darker day today, so I've decided I'm going to use my new toy to try and see my script as we do our recording, but I'm not really. I'll take this one off and I'll use ambient light from the lamp behind me. I hope it doesn't make it too dark, but it's important looking at church history. Some people look at history and say, I love it, I love the stories. Other people look at history and say, it's so boring, it's got nothing to do with me. But that is really wrong, guys. We need to know history to know where we're coming from. With regard to our cultures, our countries, our communities, we need to know the history. One of the things I was taught at college, at Vicar Factory, was that research your local community and see what the history is, to see how you have to go forward to portray Christ, to teach Christ, to reach people with Christ in that community. It's always very important to know where you're coming from. Another great teacher of mine once said there's a new batch of fools born every generation. And although we think when we become Christians we're the first generation, I now realise that there's probably 3 generations grown up since I became a Christian. And you have to keep teaching the same things. Because people will often just go off course. And church history helps us to see where the church went off in the past, or where it went right in the past, where there have been false teachings have come in, and how people have gone back to the scriptures or discussed things to make sure they get it right for the future. And sometimes as well, it takes one man to stand up for the truth. In one of the controversies that we may be looking at more deeply, there was an Arian controversy about who Jesus is, and they didn't get it right. And we lost the understanding, the full understanding of who God is. But one man, Athanasius, took many punishments, but persisted in saying who Jesus was, truthfully. And eventually, by God's power and God's Spirit, that one man who was right, and nobody else believed him, didn't trust him, thought he was wrong, they believed him in the end by God's power and God's Spirit, so that we now have what we call the Athanasian Creed, believe it or not, which was fixed for a particular time, was anti-Arianism, but also at the same time holds a particular truth for the church. So we're always defending truth. We're always trying to make sure that we're collectively understanding it. But if one man understands it, it's worth knowing that if he stands up and continues to stand up, then God will allow his truth to be known. So again, church history, and we're looking at Roman persecution now. Roman persecution, and how the church, the early church, became persecuted because it was breaking the rules of culture. In the culture, it was essential for their understanding of order, which they believe was ordered by the many gods, that you had to treat the Roman Emperor as a god, and you had to worship him in a particular form. And of course, for Christians, they couldn't do that. So they were thought to be immoral by many people, which is not unusual for Christians in cultures that conflict with God's word. But they were also thought to be rule breakers and people who caused harm to the community by breaking the rules. But in fact, what they did, they prevailed. And we will see that how the persecutions came up against Christians, and how it made the church stronger. We'll see things, and maybe, I really do hope and pray not, it will help us to stand firm, as others in the past helped others to stand firm for the truth. Okay, we're going back to a Roman senator called Pliny, who was a massive writer and an uncertain leader. So he was always writing back to Vespasian, the emperor at the time, to ask for advice so that he didn't get stuff wrong. And so what he did was he would write back, and we have that correspondence in part to give us an idea of what happened. And Pliny detailed in one of his letters a great request for what the crimes are that Christians were doing when they were breaking the community rules, the laws of the land. And what criminal practices did Pliny have in mind when he wrote to Trajan, Vespasian, concerning the legalities of Christianity? Ignorance about particular Christian practices made them easy targets for public suspicion, and they were accused, among other things, of practicing magic, arson, and immorality. It's quite interesting that a recent bishop of Chelmsford said that it was very, very unusual for Christians, but we were seen to be immoral in today's society. And he said that was a unique situation, but clearly from church history it is not a unique situation. And as our culture has moved away from Christianity, this particular bishop believes that we should move away from biblical truth and into community truth. In human terms, there's a great deal of validity to that, but in Christian terms, effectively it does seem to me that it is calling the Bible untrue instead of God's eternal true word. And on top of that, it is not unique for Christians to be seen as immoral because we go against the cultural rules. So popular rumour maintained that Christians practiced cannibalism when sharing in the body and blood of Holy Communion. A similar misunderstanding assumed that they practiced incest, which in most communities throughout history has seen to be immoral. Incest, that is the affection and physical love between brothers and sisters, because deep love and marriage in Christian terms was allowed between brothers and sisters in Christ. So again, it was misinterpreted as incest. Ongoing refusal to participate in the state cult by law made it impossible for Christians to clear their names. An act of sacrifice could have declared their innocence, but this they could not do. So rumours and public disdain continued against Christians. Christians willingly prayed for the state, as commanded in 1 Peter and in other parts of the Bible, but ultimately and repeatedly it was their refusal to participate in the state cult that proved the flashpoint with Rome, sparking conflict and open persecution. It was a legal duty of rulers to persecute Christians. So we're going to look now at the beginning of persecution, and the historian Tacitus, who I believe was writing in the late 90s AD through to about 120-130 AD, said this: "Accordingly, an arrest was made of all who confessed. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of arson as of hatred of the human race. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames. These flames served to illuminate the night when daylight failed. Nero had thrown open his gardens for the spectacle of these persecutions and executions, and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer, or drove about in a chariot. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion for the Christians. For it was not, as it seemed, for the public good that these people were executed and tortured, but to satisfy one man, Nero, one man's cruelty, that they were being destroyed." So continues Tacitus' account of Nero's persecution of the Christians subsequent to the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64. It is unclear whether the confession referred to was of Christianity or of arson, but whatever that confession was, many Christians met their fate. And Tacitus, though not a Christian sympathiser at all, he also thought they were immoral and criminals, clearly regarded the blame had been falsely placed. They were innocent of charges. 15 years after Claudius's expulsion of Christians from Rome because of Chrestus, Christians were an identifiable and unpopular group at whom the Emperor Nero could easily level blame for the devastating fire of Rome, which it is believed he started. There is even circumstantial evidence that the Jews may have shifted the blame for the fire onto the Christians, prompting Nero to use them as scapegoats. Whichever way, Nero had his scapegoat, the Christians. Ignatius, the apologist on martyrdom. Ignatius was keen that the Roman Christians should not prevent his martyrdom in about 115. Why might that be? Two reasons appear in his own letters. One, his desire to imitate Christ right up to death. Unless we are ready and willing to die in conformity with his passion, his life is not in us. 2. His desire to refute Docetism, one of the heresies we looked at earlier. His passion was no unreal illusion, no philosophical treatise without point. After all, if everything our Lord did was only an illusion, then these chains of mine, said Ignatius, must be an imagination too. Nero's action was the first official Roman action against the early church. In many ways it provided a precedent, a starting point for centuries to come of sporadic persecutions in Roman government. Persecution and imagery is the title we have next. Paul's confident trust in the vindication and protection of the empire in his task of preaching is strongly contrasted in the closing images of Revelation. Paul wanted to vindicate, wanted to prove that the Roman government was good in the way that it dealt with Christians. But the closing images of Revelation projected that there would be persecutions. This last book of the New Testament depicts a change in the relationship between the young church and the empire. As opposition to Rome and the ultimate sacrifice of life is clearly envisaged. And in Revelation, the name Babylon is used as a code word for Rome as well, so that Christians carrying the letter might not be seen as seditious or undermining Roman authority. It is most probable that it was written during Domitian's reign, that is around about 81 to 96 AD. That Revelation was written by John. Domitian, it seemed, had attempted to encourage the imperial cult, that is worshipping the emperor, as many countries and cultures still do worship their leaders as a god. Domitian, it seemed, had attempted to encourage the imperial cult by building a great temple for himself at Ephesus, and next to it erecting an 8-metre high, that's 24-foot high statue of himself. Domitian suggested that he should be called Lord and God, like you do. And the recipient of the revelation, the Apostle John, foresaw conflict with Rome. John wrote about this coming conflict in imagery, in pictures, in symbols, which, although difficult for us, was no doubt plain to the original recipients. We've looked at Revelation and the use of language there in the past. And if anybody's got any questions about that, please do text me or WhatsApp me or phone me or email me, and we'll have a little better talk about the language used, the imagery used in Revelation. Revelation points out that Antipas had already been killed, Revelation 2. Various other references throughout the book in chapter 1, 2, 3 and 12 indicate that persecution was close at hand. We also get that in Hebrews as well. In extra-biblical accounts, there is evidence that Domitian may have killed or exiled even members of his own royal family for being atheists, that is, Christians. And extra-biblical simply means non-biblical references, people like Tacitus, Suetonius, and other writers contemporary with those events. Here's the next title, Not to be sought out, not to be hunted down. While Ignatius was executed in about 115 and claims that others in Syria before him had met a similar fate, the details of his charge are scanty. In other words, we don't know what he was accused of, except that he'd been condemned, probably as a Roman citizen, to meet his death in the amphitheatre at Rome as a consequence of his faith. Our next glimpse at official policy, law, towards Christians is anything but scanty. It is the detailed correspondence of a meticulous bureaucrat to the emperor and the imperial reply which helps us to understand what might have been going on. The Emperor Trajan sent Pliny as governor to Bithynia in the summer of 111 AD with the task of rehabilitating the province following years of mismanagement and corruption by other Roman governors. Pliny was directly responsible to Trajan, and despite administrative experience, he didn't like to make decisions without getting the say-so from his boss, the imperial say-so from the emperor. Testimony to this are the 104 letters of Pliny concerning his mission, and 2 of these are about our subject, persecuting Christians. People within his province had been accused of being Christians, and initially Pliny had tried to punish those whom he thought deserving of punishment, but the extent of this perverse superstition, which they saw as immorality, prompted Pliny to seek guidance concerning official policy. And there probably was no official policy at the time, but actually, as with many things, when you ask a question, it can form policy. So far, this has been my procedure when people were charged before me with being Christians. I've asked the accused themselves if they were Christians. If they said yes, I asked them a second and third time, warning them of the penalty. In other words, it looks like it was illegal to be a Christian. If they persisted, I ordered them to be led off to execution. Trajan replied in another letter saying this: "You have adopted the proper course. Nothing can be laid down as a general ruling policy involving something like a set of forms of procedure. They, the Christians, are not to be sought out, but if they are accused and convicted, they must be punished." Tertullian, writing years later about Trajan's ruling, exclaimed, "What a decision! How inevitably entangled!" It sounds like many governments these days. You say one thing and do another, and many other things that confuse the rules. He says they must not be sought out, implying they're innocent, and he orders them to be punished, implying they're guilty. Trajan's reply, while still regarding Christianity as a capital offence, that is, one that deserved death, is not as unreasonable as Tertullian imagined. Trajan even granted 3 concessions. Firstly, Christians were not to be sought out. Secondly, accusations that they were unsigned or anonymous were disallowed. And last, if accused, Christians could clear themselves by sacrificing to the Roman gods. Although the first 2 provisions did protect Christians, the third did not. Christians, like Jews, consistently refused to comply with any aspect of the state religion, either by sacrificing or cursing Christ, or paying homage to the emperor, or swearing by his genius. Unlike Jews, however, Christians were unprotected from the consequences of this non-conformity, and consequently incurred the death penalty. This situation appears to have continued into the reigns of both Hadrian, 117 to 138, that's the same Hadrian who built Hadrian's Wall, and Antoninus Pius, 138-161, under whom the great universal plague called the Antonine Plague came about, with many similarities to our own plague at this time, but without anything like ours. Has nothing like the death consequences of the Antonine Plague. So when Christians were not to be sought out, but if justly accused were to be punished, this became official policy. During this time, the apologists, the people who wrote to defend Christians and Christian belief, wrote to argue Christianity's case before the pagans. 2 Jewish uprisings occurred in this period, in 115 and 132. Palestinian Christians living in Israel had not joined the revolts, and so bore cruel punishments from vindictive Jewish zealots who had control of certain areas. Christians received more lenient treatment from the Romans. So if you lived in a very Jewish area that had revolted against Rome, and you were seen to be racially Jewish but now Christian, then you were seen to be a traitor, an enemy. So not only were you being persecuted by the Romans, but you also had it from your local Jewish mates, maybe your own family too, because you hadn't joined in with them. Nevertheless, when the Emperor Hadrian rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, renaming it Aelia Capitolina, he allegedly covered the treasured Christian sites of Calvary and the Lord's tomb with temples of Jupiter and Venus, so that they could be re-established as a different focus. Marcus Aurelius is the emperor that we see at the beginning of that fabulous movie called Gladiator. A really stirring opening scene, and for my mind and my reading of history, a very realistic one. But Marcus Aurelius was a philosopher, and apparently he personally hated Christians. During his reign, from 161 to 180, official policy towards Christians changed. Not just punish them when you find them, but seek them out. As the church became more established and drew converts from all classes and all nations, so not just the poorest people, but the middle class people, and in fact the ruling classes. And we also note that in some of Paul's letters, he asks for prayer for those of Caesar's household. So it looks like there were Christians at the highest levels indeed. But as the church became more established and drawing converts from across the world because of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which allowed trade and travel for most people at most levels, it was no longer able to be treated passively, but as an alternative authority. It posed an active social threat. A Stoic philosopher himself, Marcus Aurelius, and his educated contemporaries hated and feared Christians, and they were supported in their hatred by popular opinion. In 166, the empire suffered the devastating consequences of plague, flood, famine, and barbarian invasions. While pagans tried any way they could to appease the gods, the various gods in various ways, and end this strife, Christians welcomed these events as apocalyptic signs, signs of the end of the age, of the pagan being punished. So Christians were identified as the source of these afflictions for not appeasing the Roman gods, and also for delighting, as it were, it may have seemed, in the coming of signs that they thought heralded the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. And all of this provoked popular wrath. It might be the same as a Christian today trying to defend biblical morality, and then people calling us immoral and hating us. There's plenty of evidence on the websites and on the internet of Christians and Christian view being hated. And the Bible puts a command and a demand on us to explain ourselves in love. In this context, the caution urged by Trajan and Hadrian against punishing too severely or seeking out Christians gave way to popular public policy persecution in the provinces, particularly in the areas of Gaul, which is France, and in Rome itself. Justin Martyr and his companions met their end in Rome at this time, declaring, "Do what you will, for we are Christians, and do not sacrifice to idols." Upon which these holy martyrs went out glorifying God to the customary place and were beheaded. Christian distinctiveness, and this is written by Diognetus. The difference between Christians and the rest of mankind is not a matter of nationality or language or customs. Christians do not live apart in separate cities of their own. They do not speak in any special dialect, nor practice any eccentric way of life. They live normally, dress normally. They pass their lives in whatever township, Greek or foreign, each man's lot has determined, and conform to ordinary local usage in their clothing, diet, and other habits. Nevertheless, the organisations of their community do exhibit some features that are remarkable and even surprising. For instance, though they are residents at home in their own countries, their behaviour there is more like that of travellers, transients. They take their full part as citizens, but they also submit to anything and everything as if they were aliens or foreigners, outsiders, who don't actually belong. So they took responsibility for their communities, but they lived in a way that showed that they were only here temporarily. For them, any foreign country is a motherland, and any motherland is a foreign country, because it's not their home of heaven. Though destiny has placed them here in the flesh, they do not live in the same way as other flesh. Their days are passed on earth, but their citizenship is above in the heavens. Worse persecution broke out in Gaul in 177, affecting the churches of Lyon and Vienne in southern France. An account of their sufferings was sent by the survivors to the churches in Asia Minor and is recorded for us by the Christian historian, Eusebius. What started out as mob violence ended with the official sanction of the emperor demanding that even Roman citizens were to be beheaded unless they recanted their Christian faith. We're told that 10 people did weaken, yet probably 50 or so met their deaths. A young slave girl called Blandina proved a willing martyr whose endurance and faithfulness encouraged other Christians of greater age, stamina and resource. A slave girl, bottom of the pile, proved to be one of the most resilient Christians at her execution. On the death of his father, the new Emperor Commodus, 180 to 193, eased the official attack upon Christianity, possibly because his wife, if not a Christian, was a Christian sympathiser. During this time, the church experienced a time of unity, coming together, as it had not enjoyed before. This Christian consensus was expressed in the rule of faith, another canon, as it were, the development of the Christian canon and creeds, and extensive relationships between various church centres, both large and small, around the world. Unity in belief. Okay, this was a quiet before the storm, a little period of respite, but the Severan emperors between 193 and 235 brought a period of relative peace, except for a brief outbreak of persecution in 202 that claimed the life of Origen's father and almost claimed the life of the teenager himself. If you remember from the history books, his mum took all his clothes off so that he couldn't run into the street and declare that he was a Christian and be martyred. She kept them off, so he had to hide because he was naked. That's probably our worst dream, isn't it, running through the streets naked. Septimus Severus from 193 to 211 forbade both Jewish and Christian proselytizing, that is, making Christians, making Jews out of pagans, and this resulted in a brief persecution of Christians in Alexandria and the North African coast. This was followed by almost half a century of peace. The Emperor Alexander Severus' mother became a student of Origen, and Christ was included in the emperor's pantheon, that is, the list of gods, Pan, all, Theon, God, the place of the gods. And Christians were able to own property corporately together, which is a very interesting citizenship requirement. Eusebius claims that the Emperor Philip the Arabian from 244 to 249 was himself a Christian, and tells how a bishop barred him from church until he made a confession of his sins. This cameo, however, may communicate more about the disdain Christians felt for Philip's successor Decius than Philip himself. That Origen addressed a letter to Philip and another to his wife suggests Philip was at least sympathetic to Christianity, if not a Christian. This half-century of relative quiet was interrupted by the brief reign of Maximin the Thracian, whose motive for persecution probably lay in reversing the policy of Alexander, whom he despised. So basically, he hated the Christians because somebody else loved them. It's a reaction, rather than actual opposition to Christians himself. Then came about systematic Roman persecution. You can see that title on your handout as we move forward to our next phase. So in this climate of relative peace, the churches grew, providing us with the first cemeteries and buildings of the Christian era. Of this period, Eusebius claimed, the faith was increasing and our doctrine, our teaching, was being proclaimed openly in the ears of all, in the public arena. Christianity was no longer a narrow sect, but a force with which to be reckoned. Nominal Christianity pervaded the churches. Clergy were often not those of outstanding spiritual maturity, but those who aspired to power, and the congregations in their care were given to gossip and frivolity, and were often Christians in name alone, simply another cult, another group, another culture. So, of course, God brings persecution to clear out the church. And the Decian persecutions questioned people's loyalty within the church. The empire came under frontier threat as at this time from the Goths to the north and the Persians to the east, that is, foreign armies wanting to invade the Roman Empire. Christianity posed an internal threat that could not be risked, as not only did Christians refuse military service at the time because you had to worship the emperor, but it was suspected that they favoured Persian rule to that of the Romans, a suspicion. All loyalty and resources were needed for Rome at this time, and this loyalty to their leadership was to be expressed in offering homage and sacrifices to the gods of the empire, a kind of spiritual dynamic. You do this and the gods will do that. And if you didn't conform, then you were seen to be detracting from the cultural norms, the rules of society. So if you didn't do those things, the gods of the empire would be angry and might turn against the imperial capital of Rome. So Decius, who became emperor in 249 AD and died 2 short, but for Christians devastating years later, Decius issued various edicts that determined the fate of many faithful. Initially, members of the higher clergy were arrested, bishops, resulting in the execution of many, including Pope Fabian in Rome in January of 250 AD. Only a month later, all free men, women and children in the empire, were required to offer a sacrifice, pour out a sacrificial libation of wine, and eat sacrificial meat that had been sacrificed to the Roman gods and pagans. Refusal to participate in this brought death. And you used to get a little certificate to say you'd done it, which I suppose if you were a cowardly Christian, I hate to use that word because none of us have any idea how we'll respond under threats of the state, then I presume you could forge one. But often those certificates were tested at roadside roadblocks and you were told you had to sacrifice again to prove that your certificate was real. All sorts of ways out of it and all sorts of ways to be brought into it. So, all free men, women and children were required to worship. Refusal brought death, and state officials supervised regulation and enforcement and official documents such as census and tax rolls, which provided the names of everybody certificated. Those who met the requirements were issued with that libellus, that is the certificate, which was signed proof of compliance with the laws. The church was in disarray. Christian leaders who were not arrested went into hiding or fled, but many did in fact sacrifice. Congregations followed suit, with great numbers apostatizing, that is, turning against their faith and renouncing their faith to save their lives, or gaining libelli, that is, the certificates, falsely through friends or bribes. These people were called the libellatici, that is, people who had forged a certificate to prove that they were not Christians when they were actually Christians but not prepared to stand up against the state. Even North Africans and the Montanists, previously noted for their commitment to martyrdom, gave in, choosing to sacrifice to the Roman gods or pagan gods or obtain their certificates falsely. Nevertheless, many refused to deny Christ. Those imprisoned for their faith were called confessors, while others were executed. Origen, although not dying a martyr's death, died soon after his release from injuries sustained during torture because of his Christianity. A libellus from the Decian persecution. This is a description of one of those certificates. First hand, to the commission chosen to superintend the sacrifices at the village of Alexander's Isle, from Aurelius Diogenes, son of Satabus, of the village of Alexander's Isle, aged 72 years, with a scar on the right eyebrow. They want to make sure they got the right man and address, don't they? I have always sacrificed to the gods, and now in your presence, in accordance with the edict, I have made sacrifice and poured a libation and partaken of the sacrificial victims. I request you to certify this below. Farewell, I, Aurelius Diogenes, have presented this petition. Pretty elaborate and detailed in law, isn't it? So the death of Decius in June 251 in battle with the Goths brought the persecution to an end. His successor Valerian left Christians unmolested for the meantime, but in 257 AD his policy changed. Valerian, the second wave of persecution in Rome. Many reasons could be given for this change in Valerian's policy. Three probable contributing factors to his change of policy were the severe economic pressures at the time on the empire, while the church, because of generosity and because of biblical activity, appeared to be flourishing. The suspect loyalty of Christians who betrayed Rome by supporting the invading Goths, and a fresh threat from the Persians to the east. An initial edict forbade Christians to assemble even in their cemeteries or catacombs, and required all clergy to participate in the state religion. This is not unusual today, where Christian clergy in church are allowed, but they also have to do it the state's way, and often this is against Christ. A year later, a second edict declared death to all clergy and demotion or exile for all Christian men and women of rank, that is, people in the higher echelons of society. Cyprian, Cyprian, Cyprian was one such victim who, on hearing his death sentence, responded to the proconsul, "Thanks be to God." The proconsul was the Roman official who would carry out that judgment and execution. The account of Cyprian's trial and execution continues with poetic justice when it says this: a few days later, Galerius Maximus, the proconsul, died. Valerian died in 260 after being taken prisoner by the Persians. Gallienus replaced his father as emperor from 260 to 268 and revoked Valerian's anti-Christian edicts. Instead, he declared that Christians were not to be molested and were able to return to their previously confiscated places of worship. Christianity was recognized not as an illegal religion, but as a political force within the empire. The ensuing years brought a peace and prosperity to the church. The early death of the Emperor Aurelian, 270 to 275, prevented the brewing persecution that threatened ominously in his religious practices. With his death, these plans were finished. But then came the Great Persecution. Diocletian, 284 to 305, brought the empire back from serious military threat and administrative and economic instability with a conservative policy of restoration and tradition. For ease of administration, he had divided the empire into east and west, which is very significant for the future developments of the church and Constantine and Constantinople. Each part ruled by a senior emperor, Augustus, and a junior colleague, Caesar. In the east, that is, towards Turkey, Diocletian ruled with his son-in-law Galerius as his junior colleague, and in the west, Rome, Diocletian appointed Maximian as joint Augustus, to be assisted by Constantius as Caesar. In reality, Diocletian was supreme in both halves of the empire, and his eventual abdication in 305 brought inevitable conflict for that main post that he had held over both east and west. It was not clear even to his contemporaries what caused Diocletian's sudden change of heart towards Christians. His wife and daughter have been thought to be Christians, as were high Roman officials. Yet for various reasons his toleration of Christians gradually diminished and was suddenly extinguished in 303. Here's an account at that time of the great persecution. Diocletian issued the first edict on the 23rd of February 303 from Nicomedia, ordering the destruction of church buildings, the burning of all scriptures, and banning Christian meetings. It appears that many church leaders willingly surrendered their scriptures and held them over, bearing in mind that these would have been very expensive handwritten documents at the time. Often, because of the reverence with which the document was held, they would have been illustrated, or illuminated as they call it, with great pictures and beautiful writing. Not only expensive, difficult to reproduce, and not anywhere near the 100,000 a year that are produced in our world these days. This was followed with reports of fire and tumults allegedly caused by Christians in Asia Minor, prompting a second edict from the emperor ordering the arrest of all bishops and clergy. In the summer of 303, a third edict was issued ordering imprisoned clergy to sacrifice and then be freed. Worn down by torture, clergy complied and the prisons were emptied. Following a visit to Rome late in 303, Diocletian retired to Ravenna in Italy and became very ill. Galerius took control. In the spring of 304, a fourth edict required all Christians to sacrifice and offer libations, the pouring out of drinks in a religious way, on pain of death. In effect, this edict opened declared war between Rome and the Christians. Galerius was first to enforce this edict in his provinces. Maximian put the edict into effect in the western provinces in the summer of the same year, and eventually Diocletian enforced it in February 305. On May the 1st, 305, Diocletian was persuaded by Galerius to abdicate. In the west, Maximian also abdicated, though less willingly. Great subjects from Roman history, and a great read for anybody who wants to take those sort of things further. Some contributing factors may have been the strength of the Neoplatonist school of philosophy. This suggested fiercely anti-Christian propaganda through a man who himself may once have been a Christian, Porphyry, from 232 to about 305. Whatever his history, he harboured a particular bitterness towards Christians and wrote a 15-book treatise called Against Christians, which was eventually condemned and destroyed in 448. So unfortunately today only a fragment of it survives for us to check what it was about. The interesting things about some of these anti-Christian books, it's a bit like a mirror. You can hold it up and what you read you can see behind the words what the positives were, what was going on in the church. In addition, Diocletian feared new foreign religions as they did not conform to the traditional values and society he was attempting to restore. Go back to the old ways and the good ways will come again. He didn't want to offend the gods of the empire by the ignorance of actions of non-conformists. In addition, the tenuous, the slight military security of the empire could not allow large numbers of conscientious objectors who avoided military service and whose loyalty appeared to lay elsewhere other than the empire. So Christians were a wild card that Romans could not risk. It would seem from the account of Lactantius and Eusebius that the greatest influence upon Diocletian was his junior, Galerius. Lactantius, who wrote from around about up to about 320 AD, had lost his post as a teacher of rhetoric in Nicomedia following his conversion to Christianity in about 300. This was a post given to and taken from him by the emperor. Lactantius records how the mother of Galerius, by woman-like complaints, instigated her son to destroy the Christians. Galerius then took to Diocletian, and while the old man long opposed the fury of Galerius, Diocletian was unable to restrain the madness of that headstrong man. Eventually, the headstrong young man Galerius was to succeed the emperor Diocletian, and to continue his own pogrom, his own persecutions against the Christians, the believers he hated so much. Nevertheless, Diocletian, while initially urging no bloodshed, set in motion the wheel of suspicion and intolerance. So following Diocletian's abdication in 305, Galerius appointed Constantius as his co-Augustus. That's just a title for another part of ruling Roman status. Diocletian's system was not established as a hereditary rule, that is, from the king to his son, son to his son. It was not hereditary. Nevertheless, the two most natural candidates for the offices of Caesar were Constantine, Constantius' son, and Maxentius, Maximian's son, both of whom were passed over for the title. Galerius instead appointed his nephew Maximin to assist him in the east, and as an underling to Constantius in the west. Severus. Persecution in the west ended with the abdication of Maximian. Throughout the empire, a temporary lull of semi-toleration lasted until Easter 306, when Galerius once again gave a general order for compulsory sacrificing in the eastern provinces. It happened that Maximin proved to be an even more ruthless adversary to the Christians than Galerius. Not only did he apply anti-Christian policies within the empire, but he prompted anti-Christian propaganda, including a forged Act of Pilate, that's the name of the document, Act of Pilate, that vindicated Pilate of Christ's crucifixion. Maximin also reorganized and revitalized paganism, offering a powerful and attractive alternative to going to church. Despite Galerius and Maximin's efforts, public opinion leaned favourably towards the Christians. Pagans often protected their Christian neighbours because they were good neighbours, and officials supervising the sacrifices seem to have chosen to ignore some non-compliance with the rules and regulations. Galerius was made to rethink his opposition to the Christian God in April 311 as he lay dying, possibly of bowel cancer. He wondered if his predicament was the work of a vengeful God and tried to make amends. After appointing Licinius as his successor, Galerius issued an edict declaring that Christians might once again exist and may establish their meeting houses and pray for the welfare of the emperor and the state. It was better, Galerius argued, that Christians worshipped their God than no God at all. The prisons were emptied and an amnesty declared, but this did not protect Galerius from death only a few days later. I've got a couple of accounts here as we come to a close of martyrdoms at the time, and this is the martyrdom of Perpetua in 203 AD. And this account is particularly interesting as part of it is in the martyr's own handwriting, and the martyr is a woman. It reflects the esteem with which martyrs were held in the church later on after the persecution, and possibly the element of choice in pursuing the martyr's crown. She could have got out of it. Perpetua herself records the visit of her father. He came up the hill to me to break my resolve, saying, "Daughter, pity my white hairs. Pity your father. If I am still worthy of you to call me father. With these hands I brought you to the prime of life. I preferred you to all your brothers. Do not make me a laughing stock. Think of your brothers, think of your mother and your aunt. Think of your child who cannot live without you. Go back to your decision. Renounce it. Do not ruin all of us, for none of us will ever speak freely again if you are condemned." I comforted him, saying, "Nothing will happen on the tribunal platform except what God wills. You know very well that we are not in our own power, but in the power of God." Then later, somebody else writes this account. The day of their victory dawned. The day of their victory, that is the day of their death, dawned. And the martyrs went from the prison to the amphitheatre as if they were on their way to heaven. Their faces were radiant, they were beautiful. They were moved not by fear but by joy. Perpetua followed at a gentle pace, as a great lady of Christ. as the darling of God. On Galerius' death, Licinius became Augustus in his place. That's the title of the role he held in the empire. However, Galerius Caesar, Maximin, also grabbed for the top job, and for 2 years the rival Augustuses, or Augusti, both sought to be top dog, supremacy. Maximin continued his fierce anti-Christian policy for 2 years, and towards the end of 311, Christian leaders in the East were arrested and executed, leaving a church with little mature leadership. In Egypt, Eusebius himself, an eyewitness, marvelled at the extent of the massacre and the courage and faithfulness of the Christians under such adversity. Maximin's defeat at the hands of Licinius in 313 and an agreement of political and military expediency between Licinius and the victor of the West, Constantine, ushered in a new era of toleration for Christians within the empire. So what we're seeing is that in some ways people gave up because they followed the law, and others didn't and were killed. They were sacrificed. But what it did was, in some ways it split the church, particularly when the leadership went, but in other ways it brought the church together. We also see that because of the way they died, as they went through this recanting and not allowing themselves to support the Roman Empire religion, as they went through this, people in their neighbourhood were moved to pity because they saw the way they died. And also, as we read elsewhere in other persecutions, they'd been such good neighbours that even pagan people who didn't believe what they believed protected them and hid them in many respects. It's a wonderful period of the Christian church, and a way that we need to read about and know in case persecution comes, and helps us to decide how we should do and how we should behave for Christ in certain situations if the state becomes more and more anti-Christian. There are terrible things going on in our state at the moment, and these things help us to see how we should respond to them and to choose our own course of actions. But more than that, we're going to see the most exciting periods of Christian history, I think, coming up in some respects, in the way that Constantine takes on the Christian belief and understanding, and it becomes the Roman religion, and how well everything goes from there for that particular reason. We'll also be looking at the history of Byzantium, of Constantinople, and that is a fascinating history. And if anybody wants to read about Byzantium, I've got a wonderful 3-volume history of Byzantium, which is not boring. It's stuff you just can't put down, as the Byzantine Christian Empire lasted from about 312 AD to 1453, I think it was. It might be 1448, I'm not sure, but the mid-1400s, before the Muslims toppled it. So fascinating periods, and we're going to see the outcomes of persecution now. What happened in the church and what happened with the church's relationships with the rest of society. But that we'll see next week, and I'll hand out another handout and email that to you before next Wednesday. Sorry, I just get very excited by it. I hope you are. I hope you can see models for our past, present and our future, and the way that we should conduct ourselves too. Take good care, and I'll present the next one next week. Cheerio. Bye-bye.